Don't waste your time with this one thing when it comes to crossbows. I have given up on one thing, something I have done videos on over the years. We've looked at it, we've tested things. I bought equipment to test for this, and we spent a lot of time talking about it and debating this, debating that, about deer jumping the string. It factors into that. The reality is, I am here to tell you today, after shooting crossbows in the backyard with friend of Bunjie, Eric, and him being back there with his compound bow and hearing the difference between the two, don't waste your time trying to quiet down your crossbow. That's what I think. Right here in 2024, Crossbow Appreciation Month. That's my thoughts on the subject now, after having gone back and forth on this over the years. All this different gear that they sell to try and quiet down your crossbow, and the heavier arrows that I've used over the years to quiet down the crossbow, absorb more of that energy. There's a benefit to that. You get the added penetration, you get maybe a little less vibration going through the rest of the crossbow that's left over that can damage your crossbow. But the reality is, the volume of a crossbow compared to a compound bow is so much different that there's just no point in talking about this. I've had louder crossbows like the Excaliburs, right? They're pretty loud. Boy, that's loud.
Dead on.
I've had the quieter crossbows like the Scorpion. They each have their own sound, their own voice, but they're all totally loud compared to Eric's compound bow. There's just no comparison between the two. You aren't going to turn your crossbow into that volume. And I don't think we ever get to the point with a modern crossbow currently where they're quiet enough that a deer at 20 yards isn't going to hear it and react to the sound of that crossbow. The bow, on the other hand, that thing's quiet enough that I can see under the right circumstances, maybe here where you got traffic in the background, that kind of thing, or if you're in a place that's running water, something like that, or the wind's blowing a little bit, or the deer aren't on alert, that bow, I'm betting deer don't even hear that lots of times, like at least not all the time, right? Boy, that's quiet. I understand different hunting situations, it makes a difference. I understand with deer, if they're on alert or not, it makes a difference. I understand all that stuff, right? I did videos on all that stuff. And I still think it's important. I still think our video on deer dunking the string is very important, because that is something that we have to take into account as crossbow hunters. I really think the emphasis on volume comes from compound bow hunters who switch from a compound bow to a crossbow. All of a sudden they're shooting something, man, this is loud compared to my compound bow that I'm familiar with. I don't think the rifle hunters come to crossbows and all of a sudden say, wow, this crossbow is just so loud compared to my rifle. They don't do that. It's the compound bow hunters who are coming to crossbows, I think, and saying, look, this crossbow is too loud. Me as a crossbow hunter, I have just come to terms with it now. And I just accept the fact that the crossbows are what they are, and each one of them, for that reason, I assume, and maybe this will change down the road, but I assume that the deer that I am shooting at is going to hear that crossbow go off. And for that reason, as I go forward as a crossbow hunter, now on my 15th year, 2 books into this, that kind of thing, I really have appreciated and enjoyed crossbow hunting, and I have no intention of changing or stopping, just learning more and continuing to evolve as a crossbow hunter. Currently, these days, like I wrote in my book, The Death by Bunjie Crossbow Method, accuracy is still #1 with crossbows. And when we take into account the ability of the deer to duck the string, or other game to duck the string, and again, it's going to vary by game, it's going to vary by region, varying by whether the deer is on alert looking at us or not, I am shooting at distances where I am confident that after the deer hears the crossbow go off, that deer cannot duck the string before the arrow gets there. Now, some of you are like, well, that's impossible. You can't predict that sort of thing. Well, you can, because deer are not magic, right? Deer are animals, and they react to certain stimuli, and they react only as nature allows them to react. This was a point made that a lot of people still don't understand in a Dr. Grant Woods video and in a video I did with Darren Cummings. Go watch those videos, both of them. And keep in mind the difference. Dr. Grant Woods talking about 300 feet per second, which is not a modern crossbow speed by any stretch of the imagination. Trust me, I know. But we've got Dr. Woods talking about those speeds, and then a little bit in my video talking about the faster speeds. And there are calculators on deathbybunjie.com, our joint calculators with Old Grumpy Hunter. You can check those out, and those calculators will help you get your head around this concept as well. Play around with them. The calculators are not perfect. The videos are not perfect. Your experience, you should be taking that all into account and reaching your own conclusions for your distance shooting as a crossbow hunter. But I wrote about this in my book. I want my point of aim, where I'm aiming on the deer, to be the same as my point of impact, where I'm hitting on the deer. Now, this is about crossbows, right? I'm not talking about compound bows. It's the same conversation that I get into from time to time with people saying, well, no, it's the sound of the arrow that the deer react to. You don't know what a crossbow sounds like if you think that's true. The sound of that arrow going through the air is nowhere near as loud as that crossbow going off. They're just two totally different things. That might be true for the compound bow hunters, whose bows are so quiet that the arrow is actually louder at the point where the deer is hearing it. They're hearing the arrow more than they're hearing that bow go off. That's a legit question, I guess, right? But for the average crossbow hunter who's shooting at 20, 30 yards, the deer are going to hear that crossbow, and it's way louder than the arrow. The arrow is insignificant. What the arrow does is it gives the deer a continued source for that direction of that threat, so that they turn, once they start to duck and roll, they can roll away from that arrow, right? Because that arrow is still telling them where that threat is coming from, and they're absorbing all that information all together, is what I'm thinking. But the sound of that arrow, the volume of that arrow, is insignificant compared to the volume of the crossbow going off on the average crossbow hunter's shot. I want my point of aim on the deer to be the same as the point of impact on the deer where that arrow actually hits. That's what I'm going for. That is crossbow hunting perfection. I know some of you are saying, Rich, you can't do that. You can't do that because deer do weird things and you can't predict what deer are going to do. Well, I'm going to tell you, you're wrong. I can predict with pretty good accuracy, no pun intended, what deer are going to do. We can predict that because I have dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of deer that I've shot on video, and I can go through and analyze all those, and I can look at the ones on the YouTubes and all that good stuff, and other people send me footage to review, and I can tell you that the math is there as well if you go around and play around with those calculators, and if you watch the video with Darren Cummings and take that information into account. You have to keep this in perspective. The crossbow gets fired, it's loud, but the sound of that crossbow has to reach the deer. And this is another one of my pet peeves. People are saying,
well, the speed of sound's like 1,100 feet per second, so until you shoot faster than 1,100 feet per second, your deer are just going to duck the string. There's nothing you can do about it.
It's not as though the sound of the crossbow gets to the deer and the deer just disappears, right? There's no magic here. The sound of that crossbow has to reach the deer. The deer, then, is a living being, not a computer, and it has to evaluate that sound. Now, it can do it probably faster than humans can, but it still has to evaluate that sound and say, hey, that's a threat. And then, and only then, it can move. But it doesn't, again, it doesn't just disappear. It has to slowly begin to respond to that shot and duck. They can only move down and drop at the speed of gravity, which accelerates, right? So at the beginning of the drop, it's real slow, but then it speeds up because gravity accelerates. And all these deer are doing that. They can't hold on to the ground and pull themselves down. The speed of sound is only a small part of this equation. It's a starting point for the consideration, but it isn't the whole consideration. I can tell you there is a visible difference in deer ducking the string between a 300 feet per second crossbow or a 250 feet per second bow and a 400 feet per second crossbow, and I'm sure even more on a 500 feet per second crossbow. Although I don't have any first-hand experience shooting deer with a 500 feet per second crossbow. Yet. By my calculations, both using the calculators and my personal experience, when I've moved up to 350 or above feet per second in a crossbow, closer to that 400 feet per second range, those deer are not ducking the string with 30-yard shots. Shot a doe with a scorpion death stalker. Shot 2 bucks with the SWAT X1. You start to see a little bit of movement on a buck in Pennsylvania that was alert and looking at me, that I had stopped intentionally. He's trying to locate me, right? Got his mind off the doe for a second, got him to look at me and get him to stop for a shot perfectly, 32 yards, Burris Oracle X, perfect aiming with the Burris Oracle X. And that deer maybe gets an inch out of the way, right, at 32 yards, maybe an inch, but essentially a perfect shot. And the deer goes 40 yards and piles up and everybody's happy, and it was great. That's the way it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be that way every time. Every time. I really feel confident now that at 30 yards and in, I can aim where I want that arrow to go, and I can expect that arrow to impact where I want it to go. As crossbow technology improves and all the other components improve, we're going to get to a point where we can do that at longer distances as well. But right now, 30 yards, if I can go into the woods and confidently pull the trigger and have my arrow go where I am aiming every time at 30 yards and in, that is crossbow hunting perfection for me. You don't get that with the old slow stuff, right? Watch Bunjie in Maryland shooting at a deer that's at 25 or 30 yards away. The arrow, when that arrow passes the 20-yard mark, I spine that doe because it's outside that comfort zone, right? It's outside the 20 yards with that crossbow. 20 yards is definitely the high end of where I should be shooting with that crossbow with those heavier arrows. You can go with lighter arrows, but you're still going to have the same penetration problems. That's not the fix. The fix is increase the speed. If I shot that same doe with the SWAT X1 with the enforcer, that is a pass-through without that deer moving. Period. Hope you have enjoyed this video. Hope you get something out of it. I hope you check out my books, and I also hope that you sort of take this into account in constructing your own crossbow hunting method. And for this reason, I probably won't do an awful lot of videos going forward on how to quiet down your crossbow. And until next time, all hail Bunjie.